Welcome to this online edition of China in Focus. My special guest today is Chi Lo. He's actually well known to the public at the Bruno Kreisky Forum since he came to Vienna and participated in a real discussion, in-presence discussion in January. Chi Lo is a senior economist. He's a lecturer at the Chinese University of Hong Kong and the author of 11 books on Chinese and Asian economic development and markets, as well as a commentator on international media and a featured speaker at many international conferences. Welcome, Chi, on this online edition. Now, when you were in Vienna in January, and when you spoke about Hong Kong and what future as a democracy and center of global finance is there for Hong Kong, you pointed out that Hong Kong was already experiencing quite a bit of headwind, strong headwinds, as a matter of fact. And you also pointed out that there were some missed opportunities in the history of Hong Kong, where Hong Kong did not seize occasions to diversify away from the financial services. Properly speaking, of course, in financial services, Hong Kong continues to be a very, very important place. And then you also, by way of a conclusion, you saw the future of Hong Kong lying in a stronger economic integration with the development of the Greater Bay Area, and also some kind of engagement with the Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese government. Now, since January, a lot of things have happened in Hong Kong, but also in the world. Most of it, perhaps the corona pandemic that all the governments were really surprised by, or the societies were surprised by. What happened in Hong Kong since January, if you take a very broad look at things?
Yes, indeed, a lot of things have happened since I came to Vienna in January. And Irene, thank you for a very accurate summary of what we talked about 10 months ago, 11 months ago. And now the new things that have happened obviously included the national security law, which was implemented in Hong Kong on the 1st of July. And then a big change in the social environment, where the social unrest that we experienced for more than a year actually went away. I think it was also because of the COVID-19 pandemic that helped to sort of, fade away the social unrest, but also the national security law, when it's implemented, there's a proper framework to deal with issues like this. So, and then lastly, in my opinion, from what I've heard and talked to people, information that I get, the funding for those social unrests from various vested interests has basically dried up. So a combination of these three big factors, national security law, the COVID-19 pandemic, and dried up of funding, has actually turned Hong Kong back to sort of a more stable city, quiet, precisely because of the pandemic, that people just don't come out much. So that's the background there. In terms of policy, of course, you probably have read and heard from the media, from the newspapers and things like that, that the US reaction to the implementation of the Hong Kong national security law was rather drastic, although it's not extreme. And that reaction from the US certainly has some impact on the Hong Kong system. So to summarize what happened in the past 10 months, Hong Kong actually has fallen into a very deep economic recession because of the combination of the social issues, the COVID-19, the US reaction through trade and certain sanctions and so on. And the recession that we are still going through actually is quite deep, because we have in the past 2 quarters more than 9% contraction on a year-over-year basis in each quarter. So basically, we're looking at a very bad economic situation here, and we're still trying to get through. Now, one of the good things that we have is that Hong Kong has got the pandemic control quite well, even though we didn't need to follow the very drastic measures that China put in for mainland China. So we are much more liberal, we are much more open here, and so we have got our pandemic control pretty well here. That overall, since the outbreak, we have about 5,000 plus cases in total, and about 108 people died so far, and nearly all of them were, old people with long-term illness. So I think that is something, a cold comfort, if you would, for Hong Kong.
Yeah, that's something very good. Now you pointed to the U.S. reaction to the implementation of to the adoption and implementation of the national security law as very very direct and very important. The European Union, of course, also reacted in council conclusions in July or in June.
Yes.
And what they said is that the European Union sees it as a massive erosion, an extensive erosion of rights and freedoms that were supposed to remain protected until at least 2047, and expressed great concern also about the lack of safeguards and clarity in the law and about its extraterritorial provisions. And the European business community, as far as we can tell in Hong Kong, sees this national security law also as a further factor in diminishing the attractiveness of Hong Kong as a business hub. How does business in general see this situation?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. If you talk to the local businesses, the local tycoons, they basically welcome the national security law, because we've seen improvement in the social environment, that business can get back to normal. If it were not because of COVID-19, I think we would be quite okay. But of course, to be fair, China has not done a good PR work, if you would, in educating Hong Kong or telling people about the national security law. So there's a lot of uncertainty and mistrust in China, whether China will implement the law, use the law in a proper way, or whether China would use the law as a way to purge dissidents. So that is the key problem here. Now, on the ground, I think even if you ask many foreign businesses, they don't really see much changes in the business environment here. And even China established this office for national security for the country in Hong Kong. Actually, the office is quite near to where I live. They behave very well. There's no special things that happen since this new office set up, and I walk by the office every day, every morning when I go to work, every night when I come back home from work. It's just life as normal. So I would say for laymen like us, people, citizens like us, we haven't really seen any suppression, any repression. We are still pretty free to talk. But of course, right now with the new law, you cannot insult the national flag. You cannot insult, government. You cannot, instigate thinking about Hong Kong independence and things like that. Now, from China's perspective, I mean that's what they want to do, because they don't want to see the country disintegrate. But from a Western perspective, the understanding would be different, because in a case like Hong Kong, if it were in a Western framework, things will probably go to a referendum. And, if people want Hong Kong to go independent, they go independent. So that's the Western system. But in the Chinese system, they don't work that way because the Chinese definitely want to keep their territory intact. So, and for business, I think a few months ago, Bloomberg did a survey on the Hong Kong CEOs, COOs, CIOs of multinational companies, local companies, and Chinese companies, and so on. And the response that came back was overwhelmingly that nobody has actually seen much change in the operating environment. We are still running on common law system. We are still using the same courts. We are still using the same judges. So at least, at this point, there are no signs that things have deteriorated. And also, if you look at capital flows, if there's a big concern about this national security law ruining Hong Kong, we should have seen a lot of capital flowing out of Hong Kong. There was some capital that flowed out of Hong Kong, but it's nowhere near capital flight, as many of the people speculated. And you can look no further than the Hong Kong dollar exchange rate. Throughout the past, since the national security law was enacted, the Hong Kong dollar exchange rate was, stuck on the strong side of the Hong Kong MA's comfortability range, and the Hong Kong MA has to intervene to prevent it from going higher. So I think that is a very strong signal that confidence is still here. But to be fair, a lot of business people, a lot of people are on a wait and see to see how China actually implement the law.
Yeah. So in many ways, the law may also be some kind of a general warning that people heed and start to be a bit more cautious about things that they might not have been so cautious about in the past, without any obvious need for the law to be implemented very harshly at this point, if I understand.
That's right. Just like any law against any crime, right? If you don't commit a crime, the laws are not binding.
Effect. Yeah.
So that's how I see it.
So you said that the impact of the Corona crisis was very bad in terms of the economic situation in Hong Kong, but you expect the economy to recover anytime soon?
Unfortunately not. We just went through 2 quarters in a row of more than -9% contraction. Now, in the next 2 or 3 quarters, we should see the contraction narrow, not as bad as before, but that was basically because of the low base effect last year, that it was so bad that this year the growth rate was calculated from a very low base last year, so that the contraction wouldn't be so serious in the next few quarters. Now, for Hong Kong to go back to sort of normal growth, 3-4% a year, I think it will take much longer time, more than a year, maybe even 2 years, depending also on Hong Kong, whether Hong Kong is willing, as I concluded in January in my remarks there, whether Hong Kong is willing to work closely with China and get integrated with the National Development Plan. If it does, I think the day for Hong Kong to get back to normal will come quicker. Otherwise, it will be more difficult.
So what, if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that the Corona crisis in many ways hastened, increased the speed of the manifestation of the economic problems of Hong Kong, but it didn't create those problems. These were the structural problems that were in place already, right? And Corona made it even worse.
Yeah. Now the COVID-19 pandemic actually hit Hong Kong very hard, but it hasn't hit China that hard. Well, it hit China hard as well, but then China came back very quickly. Yeah. So a common question that people ask is, Hong Kong is so close to China, it's part of China, and Hong Kong, rely a lot on Chinese growth for Hong Kong to grow. So why hasn't Hong Kong recovered along with China? Because China started recovering in the second quarter.
Yeah.
And in the last quarter, China grew by 4.9%.
Yeah.
But Hong Kong was still contracting by more than 9%.
Yeah.
Now, the key difference here is the key difference between Hong Kong inability to recover fast, but the Chinese economy can recover much faster is because there's a huge production base in China that as long as China, the Chinese pandemic is under control, the factories can be reopened, production lines can be turned on, and then, supply comes on board, and then, people can start buying things and so on. But Hong Kong, the bulk of our economy will still face a very hard, difficult time.
Yeah, yeah.
That's the key difference. Yeah,
that's the key difference, right? We spoke about the different economic trajectories of Hong Kong and mainland China, and you pointed out that the economic situation in Hong Kong currently is quite difficult. Could you elaborate a little bit on that?
Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, and also on top of that, we have the impact of the trade war between the US and China. Now, but I would say the key difficulty that Hong Kong's economy is experiencing comes from the COVID-19 pandemic, not so much from the trade war, because Hong Kong is a small open economy. So mobility, trade, and so on is very important. But because of the pandemic, Hong Kong basically lost all the tourism. And tourism accounts for 40% of our total sales in Hong Kong. And also, tourism from China is especially important. And because of the COVID-19 problem, basically we have almost zero tourists, especially from China. So that cuts off a lot of the income and activity there. And then what aggravates the situation further is the trade war between China and the US, because we sell more than 60% of our exports to China, which in turn sells it to third markets, including the US. And because of the trade war between China and the US, it hurts our export too. So that aggravates the Hong Kong economic problem. But I would say the trade war impact directly on Hong Kong is not that bad, because we directly sell only about 1% of our exports to the US. And so far, despite the trade war with China, the US hasn't really imposed any of those tariffs on Hong Kong exports. So we are not really directly affected by the US-China trade war there, but indirectly through China, we are hurt. So that's why in the past 2 quarters, Hong Kong, for each quarter, contracted by 9% on a year-over-year basis for each of the last 2 quarters. And overall this year, we are expecting the economy to contract by about 7%. So that's quite difficult for us.
Very difficult. And what is the expectation for a recovery for Hong Kong?
The market now is expecting next year, Hong Kong's growth will go back to about 5%. Now that sounds like a good number, but on a net basis, we are down 7% this year. And even if we go back by 5% next year, we are still losing 2%, which means that Hong Kong still cannot recoup all the output losses during the COVID-19 crisis and also the trade war. So I don't think people in Hong Kong will really feel any better next year. Well, they feel better because things are turning positive, but then for those who lost their jobs, it's still difficult to get back a job.
Yeah, and in China, the economic recovery is already quite good, isn't it?
It is indeed. That's mainly because the Chinese economic recovery is driven by production mainly. Even Chinese consumption, when you look at Chinese consumption, it is still very sluggish because of the mobility restriction, because of the hangover from the COVID-19 and so on, which hurts confidence. But because China is a big production economy, So as soon as it gets the pandemic under control, it turns on the production lines, and then everything gets back to onto the production mode. And also, while the rest of the world are still suffering from the COVID-19 shock, their production stopped. So they still have to buy something. So one of the key places that they buy from is China. So that's why China recovers much faster. While Hong Kong, being a small open economy relying on services and tourism, we are lagging behind.
Will this economic disparity make it even harder for Hong Kong to maintain its special role?
Well, it depends on how you look at it. Because from a trade perspective, Hong Kong's special role has been eroded. Especially now that the US has taken away Hong Kong's special economic status, which hurts Hong Kong a bit, not too significantly. But Hong Kong's special role in the financial world, I think, is still there, especially in China's context. Because when China continues to open up, Hong Kong still plays a role in terms of being the international financial hub for the Chinese market. We have all the financial framework here, the infrastructure in Hong Kong, which is still way ahead of China. Mm. The key, as I concluded in January when I spoke at the Kreisky Forum there in person, is still that Hong Kong needs to integrate into the big China roadmap. And when we can do that, then the Hong Kong special role will remain to do. And I still see that as very important, whether it's in internationalizing renminbi, the Belt and Road initiatives, the Greater Bay Area development. Hong Kong does have a role there.
Yeah. Now, the last several weeks, we were all looking to Washington and to the US elections there and the unfolding drama there. Right. Of course, China was very cautious in reacting to the election results. Only last week, the Foreign Ministry offered a very, how shall we say, ceremonial statement about Biden's election. What do you expect from the change in government in Washington, a change that is surely to come, even if Mr. Trump continues to drag his feet a little longer?
Well, I think, on an assumption that Mr. Biden will run White House, I think the next 4 years under the Biden administration will be a little easier in terms of Sino-US relations. Because what I see in a nutshell, a Biden presidency would mean the end of trade war, basically, but not necessarily the end of the technological war, because the Sino-US competition on the tech area is going to be for a long time. But as far as the trade war is concerned, because from my understanding, Mr. Biden is a supporter of multilateralism, but not unilateralism, which Mr. Trump is. So when that policy direction changes from unilateralism to multilateralism, I would expect that there will be more dialogue between China and the US on trade, on diplomatic issues and things like that. So the indicators to monitor to see whether there's improvement in diplomatic relations would include whether the Biden administration would revive the strategic and economic dialogue with China, which has been put on hold under the Trump administration, and also possible reopening of the consulates in Chengdu and Houston. So these will be the two very key indicators that we see improvement to come along. And also, Biden is more engaging and rational in Beijing's perspective, which makes the Chinese government more comfortable in dealing with the Biden administration going forward. Because as I said, at least there are dialogues that can be expected from the Biden administration. Now, even on issues like Taiwan, Hong Kong, I think Mr. Biden is more flexible in dealing with these key issues. On Taiwan, for example, from my understanding, Mr. Biden wants to keep the status quo. He wants to keep the one China policy, but at the same time, he would also want to sustain the Taiwan Relations Act. So basically, he doesn't want to make any big shocks to the current situation there. And in Hong Kong, the same thing, that he doesn't really want to interfere much. And we do expect that there will be more dialogue between the two countries, even on the political side. The difficult nut to crack, if you would be on the technology side. Because I think the whole US administration, whether it's under Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, there's a consensus that they would want to keep their number one position in technology. But at the same time, China is catching up very fast. So that competition will go on. And I don't think that there will be any let up on the technology war going forward. Although I think that still the way that Mr. Biden will handle the tech competition will be quite different from Mr. Trump. It's a matter of style versus direction. Direction won't change, but the style will change.
And this technology competition for many people, of course, is epitomized by the conflict about Huawei and the 5G network, right?
Yes.
Do you expect any?
Yes, very much so. And I don't think. As I said, I mean, it depends on the dialogue, how the dialogue goes on. But from China's perspective, it has prepared for no truce from the US on companies like Huawei, ZTE, and so on. And that's why China has shifted its policy since May to the so-called dual circulation, which focuses on self-sufficiency, especially on tech area. That in the short term, China will be hurt if the US continues those sanctions against exports to Huawei and companies like that. But going through, get past the short term, I believe the Chinese will come up with their own production. You probably know that Huawei has already set up a new production facility in Shanghai, a new lab, a new manufacturing facility to produce semiconductor chips within China. Yeah. So give it another year, maybe 2 years. I won't be surprised to see, Chinese produce semiconductor chips so that they can actually live independent of the US semiconductor chips.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if I ask you for the next little while in the relationship between Hong Kong and China, in terms of the development of Hong Kong. As a financial center, as a democratic place, what are the 3 things that you would watch out for? Where do you see critical development areas?
The most important thing to watch out for is how China implements the national security law. Because at this point, my assumption is still that the national security law sits at the top of the Hong Kong system as a sentinel for sovereignty, basically. And then in the system, China would still allow whatever exists in the system here in Hong Kong to continue. Like we will continue to run on the common law legal system. We'll continue to use the same courts. We'll continue to have the same financial system. Continue to run the Hong Kong dollar peg. Nothing changes there. So I think that setup will be very important to keep international confidence in the one country, two system that China has promised. Now, I am positive about that because if you look across, up north to Macau, Macau is something like Hong Kong. It has its own currency, its own central bank, its own legal system, which runs on the civil law system, which is more European instead of common law. And then it has its own free market system. Yes. But then it also has a national security law. And things go quite well in Macau. So I expect Beijing would use the same approach as it uses in Macau to allow Hong Kong to run its own business, yes, while just there's a national security law at the top to keep the sovereignty issue, within the comfort zone that Beijing can, it can handle. So if that's the case, and I think, if for the next 27 years, Hong Kong will go back to, a pretty stable and an important financial center for the region, or even for the world, as well as for China.
Mm-hmm.
But if the implementation goes wrong, and if Beijing comes down hard on using the national security law as a tool to purge dissidents and so on, that will be a different story. So time will tell.
Yeah. And the second most important thing to watch out?
The Hong Kong dollar peg. The Hong Kong dollar peg is, against the dollar, is the key confidence anchor for the whole financial system in Hong Kong. And as long as the peg is still here, whoever comes to invest in Hong Kong, or through Hong Kong to other parts of the world, there is no foreign exchange risk. Right? If you come in today, and if the peg is still there for the next 5 years, 10 years, your corporate planning, your expectation will remain that today, how much you pay to buy Hong Kong dollar, 5, 10 years down the road, you still have the same exchange rate that you get back your money. So that's very important. And I don't think that will change, in the medium term there, because that is basically, the anchor for confidence in Hong Kong. I don't see any reason why Beijing wants to change it. Mm-hmm. So that's a very important factor there. Now, the third factor would be, I would say, the US-China relations in relation to Hong Kong.
Yeah.
If, as we expect, that Mr. Biden's administration will become more benign in terms of more engaging in dialogues rather than unilateral actions, then Hong Kong being sandwiched between China and the US will have a much easier time.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we could go back to what we went through in the past year with all this social unrest and things like that.
Yeah.
So the US-China relations is a third factor that affects our livelihood here, if you would.
Thank you so much, Chi. I think we are coming to the end of our time here. It was fascinating to listen to you, and thank you very much for making the time. We will definitely watch out for Hong Kong and watch for the 3 indicators that you indicated as the most important ones. With that, I will stop the recording of our conversation now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.